I want you to try an exercise with me. Just imagine the loudest, most chaotic environment you can possibly conjure in your mind.
Oh, we're talking like absolute bone-rattling sensory overload.
Exactly. Picture a battlefield, and not just, a minor skirmish, like an apocalyptic clash of armies.
Right, the kind where the ground beneath your feet is physically shaking from like tens of thousands of boots.
Yeah, and the air is just thick. It's choking with black smoke, swirling ash, and that copper stench of blood.
It's totally deafening. You've got the relentless clash of steel, the horrific roar of these massive, armored beasts tearing through the
And
lines.
the screams, right. Soldiers just fighting for their absolute survival. It is pure, unadulterated thunder. You are completely enveloped in this sheer, overwhelming scale of world-ending destruction.
Wow, okay. Vivid.
But then imagine you step through this heavy stone doorway, and a thick oak door just slams shut right behind you.
And the thunder just vanishes.
Ex
All those roaring beasts, the clashing steel, it's entirely severed, and you find yourself standing in this cavernous room that is just dead silent.
right. And the air in there isn't thick with smoke anymore. It's freezing. It's stagnant.
Smelling of like ancient dust and cold marble.
Yes. And the lighting is incredibly dim. Just a few flickering torches casting these really long, unnatural shadows.
So instead of thousands of people fighting for the fate of the world, you're looking at just a handful of individuals in this room.
But here's the thing. The tension in this quiet, still room is somehow infinitely heavier.
Oh, absolutely. It's infinitely more suffocating than the sprawling battlefield you just escaped.
Because in this room, a completely different kind of tragedy is just quietly, methodically unfolding.
Yeah, and that jarring, almost violently abrupt transition is exactly what we're exploring in today's deep dive.
Right. We are looking at a moment where a grand, sweeping epic is suddenly distilled down to this terrifyingly intimate scale.
We are stepping right into the Return of the King, specifically Book 5, Chapter 7.
The Pyre of Denethor.
That's the one. And our mission for this deep dive isn't to break down the grand clash of armies outside.
No, we aren't here to, map out troop movements or analyze the siege tactics of Mordor.
Right? Or celebrate the sweeping heroics out on the Pelennor fields. Instead, we're pivoting entirely inward.
We're going to explore the internal corrosive cost of war.
Yeah.
We are really examining the psychological collapse of a leader who is just under unimaginable, mind-breaking pressure.
And we're going to dissect that razor-thin, incredibly intricate balance between hope and absolute despair.
Because it's taking a step back from the spectacle, to dissect a psychological unraveling, it proves something incredibly powerful about narrative and just human nature in general.
It really does. It shows that the most intense, consequential battles don't always happen on a blood-soaked field.
Right.
Very often, the most devastating wars are fought entirely within the confines of a single human mind.
And when Tolkien pivots sharply inward like this, after the absolute chaos of the siege, he delivers what is arguably one of the most psychologically intense sequences in the entire narrative.
Okay, let's unpack this, because it's kind of like watching a massive $100 million blockbuster movie, right?
Oh, I love this analogy. Go on.
Imagine a scene with a colossal explosion. Debris is flying in slow motion, the orchestral score is swelling to this deafening crescendo, peak cinematic chaos.
Right.
And then the director abruptly cuts the audio track to zero.
Just total silence.
Exactly. All the background noise, the music, the explosions, it's all gone, and the camera just pushes in agonizingly tight on a single character's face.
And all you can hear is just like the ragged, uneven sound of their breathing.
Yeah. Why is that so much more unsettling, to strip away the grand battle and force us into this one quiet room?
Well, what's fascinating here is that the contrast itself is the mechanism that generates the dread.
Ah.
When you have armies clashing outside the gates, there is a kind of external momentum to it. You could lose yourself in the sheer scale of the conflict.
Yeah, it's terrifying, but it's an external physical terror. You can fight against it with a sword or a shield.
Exactly. But by pulling you out of that momentum and placing you in the silent stone halls of the Rathdin and, the tombs of the kings.
You're forced to confront something way more insidious.
You are. You're forced to look at the hidden, deeply personal tragedies that just rot away behind the thick walls of great cities during crises.
It physically traps you. Like out on the battlefield, a soldier can run.
Right. They can charge, they can retreat, they can physically do something.
But in the silent hall, you can't be distracted by the action anymore. You are trapped with the suffocating psychology of the characters.
And the grandeur of a battlefield naturally allows for a certain emotional distance. I mean, a wide shot of 10,000 orcs is basically a statistic.
Wow, yeah. But a tight shot of a father preparing to burn his son alive, that's a nightmare.
That's entirely a nightmare. This quiet room demands your full psychological bandwidth. This is about the collapse of a man who has carried the unimaginable weight of a dying empire for far too long.
And who ultimately just cannot withstand the crushing gravity of his own despair.
The absolute silence of the room is what makes the internal screaming noise of that despair so deafening.
And this silence is, it's the necessary, stark backdrop for a complete structural breakdown. We are watching the collapse of Denethor, the Steward of Gondor.
Which is huge because up until this specific moment, he's been viewed as an absolute immovable pillar of strength.
Right. So to understand why his fall is so catastrophic, we have to look at the anatomy of this collapse.
Which means we really need to understand exactly who Denethor is.
Our sources point out that he is defined by three very specific pronounced traits: a towering intellect, immense pride, and an unyielding will.
Okay, so he's been carrying the weight of a kingdom on the brink of annihilation. And he's been secretly looking into this mystical device, the Palantir, right?
The Seeing Stone, yeah. Using it to gather intelligence and measure his own waning strength against the overwhelming, limitless might of Sauron.
And after doing the math, after calculating the odds, and, crucially, after believing his last remaining son, Faramir, to be fatally wounded.
He simply breaks.
It is a profound study of how the very traits that elevate a leader can be weaponized against them by their own mind.
Okay, wait. I want to push back on that premise for a second.
Sure, go ahead.
If a leader is historically defined by having a razor-sharp intellect and an ironclad, unyielding will, shouldn't those be the exact tools that save them in a crisis?
You would think so, right?
Yeah, I mean, when the walls are crumbling and the enemy is at the gates, you want the smartest, most strong-willed, logically minded person in the room making the decisions.
Definitely.
So how do the very attributes that make him a formidable leader become the exact mechanisms that destroy him?
Well, let's break down the mechanics of his intellect first, because it really is the foundation of his downfall. Denethor's high intellect led him to rely heavily on the Palantir. And he didn't use it to look for hope. He used it as a cold, hard intelligence-gathering tool.
He was looking for raw data.
Exactly. He was calculating the facts on the ground, assessing the troop movements, the supply lines, the sheer numerical advantage of Sauron's forces.
He's running the numbers with the cold precision of a military tactician.
Right. But what happens when a purely intellectual, data-driven approach is applied to a scenario where the numbers are astronomically against you?
Oh, I see. It tells you that defeat is a mathematical certainty.
Yes. It provides an inescapable, deeply logical conclusion. He isn't hallucinating the enemy's strength. He's accurately measuring it.
And that is where his pride acts as the accelerant, isn't it?
Spot on. Because of his immense pride, Denethor was utterly convinced that his calculations were absolute and infallible.
He believed he was seeing the entire board.
He trusted his own intellect so implicitly that he couldn't possibly imagine there were variables he wasn't seeing.
And his unyielding will meant that once he reached this logical conclusion that the city would fall and all was lost, he locked into that reality with an iron grip.
Right. This loss of faith in victory wasn't like a sudden fleeting moment of panic.
No, it was a slow, agonizing drip of devastating data feeding into a proud, rigid mind over months and years.
Think about how this manifests in everyday life for you, the listener. Have you ever overanalyzed a problem until it just paralyzed you?
Oh, absolutely.
You stare at a stressful situation, maybe a failing business, a complex legal issue, or a deteriorating relationship.
And you gather all the facts, you look at all the possible angles.
You map out every potential outcome, and you think about it so deeply and logically that it suddenly feels entirely impossible to solve.
You essentially trap yourself in a maze of your own intellect.
Exactly. Now scale that up. Imagine doing that. But instead of stressing about a career move, you have the lives of thousands of people and the fate of an entire civilization resting on your ability to find a solution.
That is Denethor. He literally lodged himself into a corner of absolute despair.
And that is the precise danger of an unyielding will paired with unchecked intellect and devoid of perspective.
Because when an iron will is applied to a state of hopelessness, it doesn't bend. It becomes an immovable, aggressive despair.
He didn't just casually lose hope. He became actively, fiercely committed to his hopelessness.
Because he believed he saw the situation with perfect clarity. He viewed himself as the ultimate realist in a room full of naive dreamers.
He looked at the vast, sprawling armies of Mordor. He looked at his own dwindling, exhausted forces, and his intellect told him the equation was completely unsolvable.
It's terrifying because, from his vantage point, his descent into madness is deeply, undeniably rational.
And this overwhelming, data-driven despair leads him to make a choice that is fundamentally horrifying.
Right. He decides to burn himself and his gravely ill son, Faramir, alive on a funeral pyre.
Which, on the surface, if you just hear that description, it sounds like pure, unadulterated madness.
Just a total chaotic mental break.
But here's where it gets really interesting. The underlying psychology frames it as something much more complex.
Our sources point out it's portrayed not merely as a loss of sanity, but as a deeply distorted, desperate grasp for control.
Denethor refuses to be conquered. He refuses to let Sauron dictate the end of his bloodline.
So in his mind, dragging himself and his son onto that pyre is a supreme act of defiance.
It is the ultimate expression of his pride mutating into its most toxic form. He is trying to author his own ending rather than letting the enemy hold the pen.
It's the darkest, most twisted, apocalyptic version of "you can't fire me, I quit" imaginable.
Yeah, that's exactly it. The logic in his mind is pristine. He's thinking, the enemy wants to breach my walls, conquer my city, break my mind, and extinguish my family line.
Therefore, I will destroy myself and my family first, thereby robbing the enemy of their prize.
He genuinely believes he's reclaiming his agency. He's taking the steering wheel just to drive the car off the cliff himself, rather than letting Sauron push it.
But that analogy of taking the steering wheel to drive off the cliff highlights the tragic illusion of his control.
How so?
Because in Denethor's mind, striking that match is a statement of sovereignty. But in objective reality, it is a total abject surrender to the enemy's goals.
Oh, wow. Yeah. He is doing Sauron's work for him.
Exactly. Sauron wants the leadership of Gondor extinguished. Denethor is volunteering to do it himself.
The stark imagery here is vital to feeling the weight of this horror. Picture the House of the Stewards, the silent, cold hall of the dead.
The funeral pyre being hastily built from wood and oil in the flickering shadows.
And the eerie, heartbreaking stillness of Faramir, locked in the fever of the Black Breath, hovering on the precipice between life and death.
The tragedy is thick and suffocating. Here is a father who supposedly loves his kingdom and his lineage, actively soaking his only remaining heir in oil.
Denethor thinks he is projecting strength, mimicking the hard, stoic choices of ancient defeated kings. But it is the absolute ultimate manifestation of hopelessness.
He has allowed the enemy's darkness to completely overwrite his reality.
He's let the data convince him that the only way to win is to destroy the very thing he was tasked with protecting.
But this twisted logic doesn't just unfold in a vacuum. It doesn't go unopposed.
Right, because into this silent, suffocating tomb steps a massive, undeniable counterforce.
An ideological clash is about to take place right over the wood of this pyre, and it comes in the form of Gandalf.
The arrival as Gandalf is where the philosophical core of this entire narrative sequence ignites.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, Gandalf stands as the direct, uncompromising counterforce to Denethor's despair.
If Denethor is data-driven hopelessness, Gandalf represents wisdom, perspective, and an aggressive resistance against the darkness.
And this resistance isn't just about fighting the physical orcs outside the city walls. It's about fighting the insidious darkness that has infiltrated the mind.
But let's pause and really look at this clash, because I think we need to push back on Gandalf's position, too.
Okay, let's hear it.
We are painting Denethor as the guy who lost his mind to despair, and Gandalf as the shining beacon of hope.
Right.
But look at Gandalf's actual overarching plan. To defeat Sauron, Gandalf's strategy is to eventually march a fraction of their remaining battered forces directly to the Black Gate of Mordor.
To fight a battle he knows they cannot win.
Purely to create a distraction for two hobbits sneaking into a volcano. Mathematically, tactically, logically, Gandalf's plan is literal suicide.
It really is.
So why is Denethor's logic considered a madness that must be stopped, while Gandalf's literal suicide mission is championed as hope? Aren't they both just choosing different ways to die?
That is a brilliant distinction to draw, and it gets to the very heart of the difference between the two characters.
Okay, unpack that for me.
Yes, both men are looking at a scenario that guarantees their death. But the intent and the direction of their agency are polar opposites.
Okay.
Denethor's choice to burn on the pyre is entirely self-contained. It is an act of closure. It ends his story, it ends his son's story, and it provides zero utility to anyone else.
It's just a withdrawal from the world.
Exactly. Gandalf's plan at the Black Gate, while mathematically suicidal, is an act of profound sacrifice directed outward.
Ah, I see.
He is spending his life and the lives of the soldiers to buy a sliver of time for someone else to succeed.
Gandalf's action leaves a window open for the world to continue. Denethor's action is slamming the window shut and locking it from the inside.
So it's the difference between dying to escape the pain and dying to give someone else a chance.
That makes so much sense. And the battle over Faramir's Pyre is a collision of these two worldviews.
Denethor represents the belief that if the odds are insurmountable, the only dignified response is a controlled, isolated end.
While Gandalf refuses to accept that utility is tied only to guaranteed victory, his ideology is rooted in the idea that as long as you have agency, you must use it to resist.
Even if that resistance only buys another hour of breath for someone else.
Imagine trying to argue with someone who is entirely locked into Denethor's spiral of absolute negativity.
It's exhausting just thinking about it.
Someone who has a perfectly logical, mathematically sound answer for every single glimmer of hope you try to offer.
Right, you say, we can hold the lower levels, and they immediately shoot it down with 5 logical reasons involving troop fatigue and supply shortages why it will fail.
It is an impossible, impenetrable wall to breach. That is what Gandalf is facing. He is trying to reason with a man who has barricaded himself inside a fortress of impenetrable logic and despair.
And Gandalf is fighting not just to win a philosophical debate, but to literally drag a living man off a pile of wood soaked in oil.
The physical struggle to save Faramir is just the kinetic manifestation of the philosophical debate.
And the outcome of this clash cements the tragedy. Gandalf succeeds, but only partially.
He manages to physically rip Faramir from the pyre. He pulls him back from the flames.
But he cannot save Denethor. Denethor's will is too unyielding.
His pride is far too deeply entrenched to accept that his calculations might be flawed, or that there might be hope he cannot see.
In the end, Denethor violently rejects Gandalf's intervention.
He takes the burning torch. He snaps his staff of stewardship, which is a deeply symbolic rejection of his duty, by the way, and he casts himself onto the pyre.
He perishes, consumed by the very fire he ordered to be built, clutching the palantir to his chest.
It's a chilling, grotesque end for a man who once stood as the very pillar of his civilization's strength.
A leader actively burning himself alive in a tomb while his soldiers bleed and die on the walls outside.
It is the tragic, inevitable culmination of his character arc. He isn't defeated by Sauron's physical armies.
No, he is defeated by the despair that Sauron actively cultivated within his mind.
Gandalf saves the physical future, represented by Faramir, but he cannot save the mind that willingly, fiercely embraced the dark.
Now, to truly make us understand why Denethor's fall is so profound, Tolkien doesn't just show us this collapse in isolation.
Right, he sets up a deliberate, undeniable contrast. He provides a scientific control group within the narrative.
We have to look at another leader staring down the exact same darkness, facing the exact same insurmountable odds at the exact same time.
We have to look at Theoden, the king of Rohan.
The narrative architecture here is brilliant. Denethor is a compelling character precisely because he isn't a cartoonish villain.
He's a tragic figure, and his tragedy is thrown into the sharpest possible relief when placed side by side with Theoden.
Both are aging rulers. Both are presiding over kingdoms in decline. Both are facing an enemy that vastly outnumbers them.
In fact, earlier in the story, Theoden was suffering from the exact same paralyzing despair, poisoned by the words of Grima Wormtongue.
They are put in identical pressure cookers. You apply the exact same level of external existential threat to both men.
And you watch the divergence in their choices.
One of them, Denethor, looks at the threat, locks the doors of his tomb, retreats into the shadows, and strikes a match.
The other, Theoden, who also knows the odds are impossible, who also knows he is likely riding to his death, gets on his horse.
He rallies his men, and he rides out to meet the storm head-on at the Pelennor Fields.
Placing these two leaders in parallel elevates the meaning of both their journeys. Denethor's fall into the shadows of the Roth. Dinan makes Theoden's glorious, terrifying charge into the dawn so much more meaningful.
And conversely, Theoden's active bravery makes Denethor's passive collapse so much more tragic.
It serves as definitive proof that Denethor's reaction wasn't the only available option.
If Denethor was the only king we saw in this story, we as readers might think, well, what else could he do? The situation was objectively impossible.
Right, like giving up was the only realistic response.
But because we literally just watched Theoden face the same impossibility and choose to blow his horn and charge, it completely strips away Denethor's excuse.
It proves that despair, even in the face of mathematical certainty, is a choice.
It forces a realization about the nature of leadership and resilience. Resilience isn't about the objective circumstances you find yourself in.
It's entirely about how you choose to process and respond to those circumstances.
Theoden accepts the reality that he will likely die on that field, but he chooses to die actively resisting, inflicting a cost on the enemy.
While Denethor refuses to accept a victory he cannot calculate, so he chooses to die passively, surrendering under the false guise of defiant autonomy.
Which brings us right to the core philosophical tension of this entire scenario.
So what does this all mean? The friction between what appears to be rational despair and what looks like completely irrational hope.
Denethor viewed himself as the ultimate realist.
He had the Palantir. He saw the troop numbers, the logistics, the sheer scale of the Black Fleet sailing up the river. His failure wasn't the lack of intelligence.
It was a catastrophic loss of perspective.
This raises an important question. Is cold, hard logic actually a liability when you are pushed to the absolute brink of destruction?
It becomes a liability when logic is applied to an incomplete data set. Denethor's vision was clouded by his own fear and pride, even though he believed he was seeing with perfect clarity.
He had the data.
But data without context, data viewed exclusively through the lens of worst-case scenarios, becomes a severe distortion of reality.
It's remarkably similar to looking at a financial spreadsheet during a massive global market crash.
Oh, that's a great comparison.
The numbers in front of you are terrifying. The trend lines are pointing straight down. If you project those lines forward using pure logic, it tells you that the economy will reach zero and society will collapse by Tuesday.
But that spreadsheet doesn't account for human innovation.
Exactly. It doesn't account for changing policies or a sudden shift in consumer momentum or a new technology being invented.
It only measures what is currently happening, not what could happen.
Pure logic, devoid of the human element, can only project the current trajectory. It cannot account for miracles.
You cannot calculate the impact of unforeseen courage or the sheer chaotic unpredictability of a desperate resistance.
Denethor's logic couldn't count for a hobbit stabbing the Witch King in the knee.
Right. He couldn't calculate the arrival of the Rohirrim. And that is where the contrast with characters like Gandalf and even the Hobbit Pippin, who is present in that tomb, becomes vital.
They hold on to hope even when the math says it's completely irrational to do so.
Because it is mathematically irrational. Hoping for victory when you are outnumbered 10-1 by immortal wraiths and giant war elephants is statistically absurd.
It is absurd. But the profound revelation here is that hope, in these extreme circumstances, is not a naive, fluffy emotion.
No, it is a gritty, absolutely necessary survival mechanism. We often treat hope as a luxury for people who don't understand how bad things truly are.
But in this framework, hope is deeply pragmatic.
Wait, how is ignoring the facts pragmatic?
Because when you are facing absolute darkness, operating purely on calculated odds will inevitably lead to paralysis. If a doctor tells you that you have a 1% chance of surviving a disease, pure logic says, why endure the painful treatment we are going to lose anyway?
Logic tells you to lie down and wait for the end.
Yes. Despair is ultimately a paralyzing entropic force. But hope, even a statistically irrational 1% hope, generates action.
It makes you take the treatment.
It makes you stand up. It makes you swing the sword. It makes you dive into a fire to pull someone off a burning pyre.
That reframes everything. Denethor's clear vision was entirely blind to the human spirit's capacity to alter the equation.
He ran the numbers, but left out the most important volatile variable.
The willingness to fight anyway.
Gandalf and Pippin's hope isn't rooted in a childish denial of the facts. They see the armies of Sauron breaking down the gates just as clearly as Denethor does.
But their hope is rooted in a refusal to let those facts dictate their internal spirit.
Holding on to hope in the face of certain doom isn't naivety. It is the ultimate, most potent act of defiance possible. Far more defiant than Denethor's pyre.
Denethor's defiance ended in ashes on a stone floor, completely unnoticed by the enemy.
While Gandalf's irrational hope, his willingness to pull Faramir from the fire, his willingness to march to the Black Gate, literally preserved the lineage of the kingdom and bought the time necessary to win the war.
Now, taking this incredibly dense, nuanced internal conflict and translating it into a visual medium presents a monumental challenge.
Right, we have to look at how the film adaptation handled this intensely psychological unraveling. Because cinema operates on a completely different set of rules than literature.
Moving from the page to the screen, with a narrative that relies so heavily on slow internal decay, is notoriously difficult. The medium of film fundamentally demands externalization.
Think about the sheer logistical difficulty of adapting this. How do you take a chapter that is almost entirely focused on slow, quiet, creeping despair and integrate that into a 3-hour, high-octane blockbuster action movie?
It's a massive challenge. In a book, Tolkien can spend 10 pages describing the architecture of Denethor's mind, his historical grievances, and his internal monologue.
But in a movie, you can't just have an actor sitting on a throne, staring into space for 30 minutes while the audience listens to a voiceover of his depressing thoughts.
It would kill the pacing of the entire film.
What Tolkien achieved through chapters of slow atmospheric buildup and intricate dialogue, the film had to communicate through immediate, visceral, visual, and auditory cues.
The timeline is totally compressed. Denethor's descent on screen is portrayed much more abruptly than in the books.
We don't see years of him wrestling with the Palantir. We see the immediate, chaotic aftermath of his broken mind.
The filmmakers had to find ways to make his internal rot visible, and they did it brilliantly through performance and juxtaposition.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Think about John Noble's performance as Denethor. There is that incredibly uncomfortable, iconic scene where he is forcing Pippin to sing him a song while he aggressively, almost violently, eats a meal.
Oh, the tomato scene.
The way he bites into the cherry tomatoes, the red juice dripping down his chin, looking exactly like blood.
Intercut with slow-motion shots of Faramir and his men riding into a literal slaughter.
It is visually repulsive. You don't need a 10-page internal monologue to understand that this man's soul is sick. You can see the sickness in the way he consumes his food while sending his son to die.
That scene is a masterclass in cinematic externalization. It takes the abstract concept of a leader's callous despair and makes it physically nauseating.
Furthermore, consider the visual motif of fire throughout the adaptation.
Right. The film places a massive emphasis on the lighting of the beacons, a chain of fire sweeping across the mountains, which is a visual representation of hope, communication, and alliances being forged.
And then you contrast that sweeping mountaintop fire of hope with the fire Denethor builds. He builds his fire in a dark, enclosed tomb, underground, isolated from everyone else.
The fire of the beacons calls for help. The fire of the pyre rejects it.
The visual spectacle of the pyre is heavily intensified in the film. It has to be.
The filmmakers needed to take the internal horror of Denethor's mind and project it outward so the audience could physically feel the heat and magnitude of his madness.
And while the subtlety of the slow, data-driven decay from the book is condensed, the emotional payload remains completely intact.
The method of delivery changes. We get more dramatic physical confrontations, a more visually chaotic pyre, an accelerated timeline, but the core impact is identical.
Whether you experience it through the slow, creeping dread of Tolkien's prose or the dramatic, fiery spectacle of Peter Jackson's film, the takeaway hits with the exact same force.
You are forced to witness the destructive, all-consuming nature of hopelessness.
You see how despair can burn a person down to ash just as completely as physical fire.
It demonstrates that while the mechanics of storytelling must adapt to the medium, universal human truths, like the danger of surrendering to fear, translate seamlessly if the emotional core is respected.
This realization that the medium dictates how deeply we can explore these themes and that unpacking the differences reveals so much about the story is exactly why communities dedicated to close textual analysis are so incredibly vital.
Exploring these layers doesn't ruin the magic of the story. It deepens it.
Deep, meaningful engagement with literature and film doesn't happen by passively consuming it. It requires an active willingness to interrogate the text, to ask difficult questions about character psychology, and to look beyond the surface-level entertainment.
If you found yourself captivated by the process of peeling back the layers of this specific text today,
If you enjoyed looking at Denethor, not merely as a crazy antagonist with a torch, but as a complex, tragic study in the limits of pure intellect and the dangers of bad data,
then we highly recommend seeking out the source of this specific analytical framework.
This breakdown was heavily inspired by the deep dives over at the Princess Toy Nerd YouTube channel.
It's a space explicitly dedicated to this kind of microscopic, thoughtful exploration of fantasy worlds.
It's a community for people who want to break down complex themes, analyze the philosophical underpinnings of epic stories, and uncover the intricate emotional mechanics that make these narratives endure for generations.
It is a wonderful reminder that the conversation around these foundational texts is never truly finished.
There are always new depths to explore, new angles to consider, and new psychological insights to uncover when you engage with a passionate community.
Let's quickly retrace the path we've walked today.
We started by stepping out of the deafening noise of a world-ending battle and into the suffocating, terrifying silence of a stone tomb.
We dissected the anatomy of a psychological collapse, exploring how the very traits that elevate a leader, towering intellect, immense pride, and an unyielding will,
Can warp into weapons of total self-destruction when fed a diet of unrelenting negative data.
We watched a profound ideological clash unfold over a funeral pyre, with Gandalf fighting not just with the physical staff, but with the philosophy of active resistance against Denethor's dark, tightly wound logic of surrender.
We examined the deliberate, brilliant contrast with King Theoden, proving that even in the face of impossible odds, despair remains a choice, not an inevitability.
And finally, we explored the absolute necessity of holding on to hope, framing it not as a naive comfort for the weak, but as an essential, pragmatic survival mechanism when the mathematical odds tell you that you've already lost.
It is an incredibly dense, emotionally taxing, and philosophically rich sequence. But before we conclude, there is a final, lingering thought that emerges from this analysis.
Something deeply relevant to consider long after you step away from this discussion.
So what's the final takeaway?
We spent a considerable amount of time discussing the primary mechanism of Denethor's despair. The narrative explicitly tells us that he lost his perspective in his mind because he gazed into the Palantir.
Right.
He utilized a device that he fully believed was providing him with the objective, unvarnished truth of the world. But in reality, it was feeding him a highly curated, overwhelmingly negative and continuous stream of his enemy's strength and the world's impending doom.
He stared into that glowing stone. He saw nothing but darkness and catastrophe, and it systematically broke his spirit.
He was given a feed of pure, concentrated anxiety.
Now, step out of Middle-earth and consider our own modern reality. Consider the devices we all carry in our pockets every single day.
We have our own glowing screens.
And much like the Palantir, they constantly feed us an overwhelming, unfiltered, and often highly curated stream of the world's crises, conflicts, outrages, and darkness.
Through the sheer mechanics of algorithms designed to capture attention, we are exposed to more bad data, more tragedy, and more global anxiety on a daily basis than any generation in the history of humanity.
The parallels are actually staggering when you frame it that way.
The question we have to ask ourselves is, how often do we risk walking the exact same path as Denethor?
When we stare into our own modern Palantirs, endlessly doom-scrolling through a relentless feed of terrible news, how often do we allow the sheer volume of that darkness to completely cloud our perspective?
How often do we let the algorithm convince us that the world is entirely broken, that human connection is failing, that hope is just a naive fantasy, and that cynical, passive despair is the only rational response left?
Denethor's ultimate tragedy wasn't that his city was attacked. His tragedy was that he let the glowing stone convince him the battle was already over before it even truly began.
He let the screen dictate his reality.
Exactly. We must be vigilant about what we let our own glowing stones convince us of.
Think about what you're staring into, and more importantly, think critically about what it's making you believe about the future.
Keep your perspective wide and hold on to that irrational hope. We'll see you next time.
Me